Applying magnets to certain parts of the outside of the skull could change people's political attitudes by disabling temporarily certain parts of the brain. You can decide what information you have in your limited sphere of perception, and therefore you can influence how you see the world and how you act and behave. But is it used for freezing protesters' bank accounts? I think that starts to get into quite risky, very risky territory. The social pressure gets you to say something that you might not think is true, but then when you say it, then you'll start to rationalize it and you start to believe it.
The conscious mind versus the unconscious mind. Patrick Fagan, are we in control of our choices? Or is it actually that our unconscious mind is ruling us? Which way round do you think it is?
Well, it's an interesting question because you are your unconscious to a certain extent. The two systems are very much intertwined and you can't have one without the other. So even for decisions that you think would be rational and conscious and carefully thought out, we're still relying a lot on our gut, on emotion, and on instinct. And there's been research showing that even if the emotional center of the brain, as it were, is damaged, that can even impact your ability to make rational decisions. So you are your unconscious, you are your emotional brain, but to answer your question, actually, it's probably the emotional unconscious brain that's a lot more in charge of our decision making. We used to think that the conscious brain was like the Oval Office in the White House, making all of the important decisions. But with new psychological research, actually, the view is now that the emotional brain is the Oval Office making the decisions, and the rational brain is the press office just coming up with rationalizations and justifications after the fact. So there's one researcher who counted all of the sensory neurons that fire in the brain every second, and he found there are 11 million, but only 40 of these go through conscious pathways. So by that estimate, we're only consciously aware of 0.0004% of everything the brain is doing. So we can be rational, we can design smartphones and skyscrapers and write plays and so on. But for most of our day-to-day decision making, for the vast majority of what we do, it's emotional and subconscious, and it has to be because we don't have the time or the energy to think everything through in careful, rational detail.
It's kind of terrifying a little bit. Where like when you outline how much like that stat right there, 0.0004%. If that's accurate, that like the amount that we're just running on autopilot is crazy. So I'm kind of thinking to myself, like with the world we live in today, and bearing this in mind, we're like bombarded by messages constantly. So I think while many of us, we like to think we are in control of our decisions, the truth is we're all very influenceable. How would you recommend, with this knowledge, that we go about not being influenced in the negative ways that society brings?
Well, that statistic was very well remembered. I will also say that it's probably not accurate. You said if it's accurate, it is really an estimate. But I've seen the biggest estimate I've seen is a third or 30% is conscious. The point being, though, the majority, most of it, we're not consciously aware of. It's automatic and emotional. But as you say, yes, we're bombarded by huge amount of information and attempts to persuade and manipulate us constantly every day. All communication really is designed to persuade. There's a double meaning in the word spell. So to spell is to lay out letters, symbols in a certain way, and to cast a spell in terms of magic. I know it sounds woo-woo, but it's basically just rearranging and using symbols to bring about certain thoughts and feelings and change behavior. So all communication is designed to persuade and influence people in some way. And so on that basis, you can't avoid it. The best thing you could do is go into a sensory deprivation tank in Siberia or something. But I did actually try that, not in Siberia. I went to a flotation tank. And still, you're with your own thoughts, first of all. And also, you can't totally get away from the senses. There's like the smell of the water, the splash of the water on the sides and so on. And even those things can influence you in some way. You know, hearing the splash of the water could bring back certain memories, elicit certain emotions. So it's very, very hard not to be influenced, impossible even. And so what you can do is limit the negative influence that you have on your life, as you say. So you are what you pay attention to. You turn into what you tune into. And so you say it's scary that we're influenced so much by all of these techniques and emotions, but there's also a positive spin. There's an opportunity and potential here to kind of craft your own reality. You can decide what information you have in your limited sphere of perception, and therefore you can influence how you see the world and how you act and behave. So some obvious examples would be, you know, if you make friends with successful people, or if you have a successful mentor, you will by osmosis kind of start to become more successful yourself as you pick up their habits and their ways of seeing the world. Or you could use Twitter to, rather than following angry people and the news, you could follow influencers who exercise or who are good at wealth management. And you'll pick up those tips and those ways of viewing the world that will improve your life.
It's very interesting. I mean, people often talk about the concept that you are like an average of the 5 people around you because you're so influenced by everyone around you. But with the internet, you can kind of pick and choose different people to listen to that you can view as role models, even though they're not technically physically in your life. You can still be much more influenced by them than sometimes people around you. But how do you go about picking the right people? I guess like the concept of surround yourself with good influences and avoid the bad ones. We can all try and do, but how do we know which ones are good and bad?
It's an interesting question. People tend to pick what reinforces their worldview that they already have. So they tend to follow influencers who say what they already agree with. We all have certain like biases and things that we're magnetically pulled towards. And so people create these echo chambers, which are just kind of like a feedback loop, like when you put a microphone next to a speaker and it screeches. It's probably not the healthiest thing. So to build good habits, I think it's quite useful to bring in other perspectives that you disagree with. This is one of the foundations of wisdom. There's a psychologist called Igor Grossman, I think, who has done research on wisdom, and one of the pillars is listening to other people's perspectives and then incorporating them with your own to come to an overall picture and kind of a middle ground. So that would be your first step. Second step, I suppose, is what is good depends on your values and what you want out of life. So it really differs from person to person, but it's probably key to work out, what do you actually want from life? Do you want to be financially successful? Do you want to be ethically a good person? And go from there to decide what type of people to follow and to have in your limited sphere of perception. That's probably, it sounds obvious, but it's probably a really powerful place to start and something that most people don't do. They probably, and I say they, I do it myself, just follow people who kind of give you a dopamine hit of, you know, anger or outrage or envy or lust or whatever it might be, rather than kind of more boring but ultimately more productive and healthy influences to follow.
Talk to me about reducing phone addiction. So when we talk about influences, I think phones are one of the hardest things to not be influenced by. We all kind of instinctively reach to grab it sometimes. And there was a study you were talking about where researchers showed that simply by having your phone out on the desk, just on the desk, participants had decreased working memory capacity and fluid intelligence. So, first up, why is this the case? And outside of the obvious answer of just putting your phone in a drawer or something like that, are there any things you think we can do to reduce phone addiction?
Yeah, that study was a very interesting one. I think there's a couple of reasons why having your phone on the desk can reduce your attention span. One would be that it's just kind of distracting, even if you're not using it or looking at it, just your brain can kind of be thinking about it, the fact that it's there. And that has what's called a cognitive bandwidth tax. So you're less able to focus on other things, even subconsciously. And the second one is it may have a priming effect. So when you use a phone, you're in a certain state of mind. There's a great book called The Shallows, which is about this. It's called How the Internet is Changing Our Brains. And technology is a very kind of superficial, fleeting. Think about the platforms we use. TikTok, which is about seconds ticking by. Tweets, which are very fleeting kind of phonemes there. These are very superficial, jumping from one thing to another. And that's the kind of state of mind we're probably in when we're using phones, and therefore having one might activate that thinking style a bit compared to, say, a book, which might activate a deeper, slower thinking style. Now, that specific study is one that has struggled with replication, I think, as many studies have in psychology. But there are a lot of others which support the same point. For example, one study found that if people walk around a museum and they're quizzed afterwards, if they were taking pictures of the exhibits, they were less likely to get the questions right afterwards because they were storing the memories to the phone or camera rather than in their own brain. Another study found that the more people use the search function on their smartphone, the worse they perform on brain teaser questions, basically, because they don't think the answer for themselves. They tend to just think to Google it instead. It produces a more kind of shallow, superficial, faster thinking style. And then to your question, what to do about it? Try to use it less. There's lots of practical tips that I can give. One is, for example, incrementalism. There's a nudge called the foot in the door technique. It's very hard to do a big thing all at once. So just try to do little steps. If you're using your phone 6 hours a day, you don't have to get that to 0 tomorrow. Why not get that down by 10 minutes this week and then take it from there? So there's little things you can do like that. Just switching off notifications can be enormously helpful. One study found that it reduced incidence of ADHD symptoms even among a non-pathological sample. So people who don't actually have ADHD still may exhibit the symptoms to some extent, but these were reduced by switching off notifications. Other studies have looked at putting your phone on grayscale rather than color, which is something I do myself, and that reduced the amount of time people spent on their phone. Putting apps that you tend to use a lot in the second screen of your phone, so you have to swipe to get to it rather than being on the home screen, may have an effect, but I don't think the evidence was as strong. Obviously, use the screen time functions as much as you can. And what I've done is given the screen time pin code to my wife. So that's an extra barrier. If I want more time, I have to kind of go to my wife, which is quite humiliating actually, and ask her to put the code in. So I'm just less likely to ask. And then just take a break as much as you can. There was a study that showed that just having, I think, a week off in the screen-free camp reduced long-term usage, but also increased emotional intelligence, at least in the time frame the study was conducted. So there's all these kind of little tips you can do. Use it a bit less, take breaks here and there, use screen time, use the grayscale and so on. But ultimately it's about, I would argue it probably is actually quite important to reduce screen time, at least manage it. You don't have to use no screen time, but manage it, especially as we move into this kind of weird world of the metaverse and the Vision Pro and everything like that. I think there's a very big risk of people kind of getting swept away in these fantasy worlds if they don't manage their screen time.
The grayscale tip that's one I've actually tried. And it is quite crazy how much of a difference it makes. You start going on your phone to scroll on Twitter or something like that. And where you used to get this almost dopamine hit, instead it just doesn't look very good. And it's weird, like you just stop enjoying it as much, you put it down quicker. I also tried locking my phone in a drawer for a full day. Like I've heard some people talk about 1 day a week, just put your phone somewhere and you're not allowed to look at it. It was kind of mental. I think the scariest thing was how often I kept reaching for it. So I'd be watching TV or something and I'd try and grab my phone and be like, wait, because obviously my phone's not available. So I'm very aware of the action that I've just done. And I'm like, why am I constantly doing it? And it almost, struck me as like an addiction, because the way I was instinctively reaching for it, and I really didn't like it when I couldn't get my phone. Yeah, it's quite scary to see.
I used to live in an apartment block, and kind of in the concierge reception area, they often have letter boxes where the mail are delivered. So I would go down to my post box, put my phone in there, and lock it, and go back up. And so that would make it less available to me. But yeah, exactly the same. I kind of It's like a phantom limb syndrome almost. And there's research showing that people they feel almost they feel attached to their phones in the same way they would feel attached to a person. They have almost these relationships with their phone because you get comfort from your phone when let's say you're distressed, you can escape into Twitter or whatever. You talk to loved ones through your phone. It's a medium for love and relationships. Um, Even some research suggests the tactile element can be soothing. Just swiping the phone can kind of feel good and be relaxing. Um, and then there's also like adult content causes you potentially to like romantically bond with your phone because you're looking at it and holding it while you're having an adult moment, so to speak. So people really do feel like, not everyone, of course, but a lot of people really do feel very attached to their phone. It's very difficult to give it up.
And it's very interesting. A lot of the techniques you were describing involved putting some sort of barrier between you and your phone. Is that something you see in psychology a lot? Just making something not impossible to do. Like you mentioned about having to go to your wife and getting her to type the PIN code in. You can do it, but
Yeah.
it makes you aware of the fact you're doing it, and it's an extra step. How impactful is that when we talk about habit formation?
Yeah, it's very important. So in marketing, there are two things it's believed that drive sales: mental availability and physical availability. So mental availability is being at the front of your mind, easy to recognize and everything. Physical availability is about being literally easy to buy. So Coca-Cola have been very good at this in the past. They pioneered cans and bottles and vending machines. They made sure they were in every restaurant and shop and so on, just being as easy to buy as possible. And they had a saying of being within arm's reach of desire. The flip side of that is people can be put off doing something if you just put a little bit of friction in the way. This is called a sludge. It's used kind of evilly by Amazon if you try and cancel Amazon Prime, and it makes you jump through all these behavioral hoops, so you're less likely to cancel your subscription. But there's all kinds of bits of research on it. For example, people are less likely to buy chocolate and sweets if they have to queue up at a second queue in the cafeteria. People are less likely to buy cigarettes if they're behind the counter, behind a drawer where you can't see them. People are less likely to eat biscuits in the office if you put the biscuit tin on a desk 6 feet away. So yeah, it is very important. And most behavior change models basically come down to what Sherlock Holmes said, I think 100 years ago: means, motive, and opportunity. But really, yeah, they come down to what's the motivation? Is there a fire in the belly to do this? And also, how easy is it to do? Yeah, the easier something is to do, the more likely people are to do it. But vice versa, if it's difficult, they're less likely to do it.
So if someone wants to change their habits, then it's important not just willpower. It's important also to design your environment in a way that supports the decision you want to make.
Yes, absolutely. So make it as easy as possible to do the desired behavior, or as difficult as possible to not do it. And there are all sorts of other kind of nudges and hacks that might be useful. I'm using a website. It seems to be working. It's called Stick with 2 Ks, and they use nudges to help you achieve your goals. So I have a weight loss goal. And what it made me do is kind of sign a pledge and make a commitment, a very clear goal to achieve. I also had to make it public by inviting someone I know via email to come and sign it so they've seen it. And then every week I don't meet my goal, they have my card details. They will give some of my money to a cause, a charity that I don't like, an anti-charity, they call it. So yeah, you can use all these nudges and design your environment to influence your own habits.
How effective have you found that? This stick, as you're talking about.
Yeah, it's been effective. I had one off week because I went to Dubai. I find it very difficult to meet any of my goals really when I'm traveling, but especially diet. I just eat all the time while I'm away. But otherwise, yeah, I've met my goal every week, 1 pound a week. It seems to be working.
Oh, that's really good. And I think this kind of links into something else you talk about in your research, which is the importance of self-awareness. So, can you describe, like, to protect yourself against manipulation? Because as you're describing, we are so influenced by the things around us. We kind of need to know which things are negative, which things are positive. And for that, we need self-awareness. So, can you talk about why this is so important and how can we actually work to become more self-aware?
It's important for two reasons, I think. One is a humility angle. So it's very important to be aware that we are all of us biased and imperfect, and our opinions are probably wrong for the most part. All of us, there's this metaphor of the blind men at an elephant. And one of the blind men is holding its trunk and saying it's a tree. One of the blind men is at the tail saying it's a rope. One is at the leg saying it's a tree. One is at the trunk saying it's a snake, and so on. So they all have a part of the truth, and that's true with all of us. We're all seeing the world through this biased, imperfect lens. We're only seeing a very small part of it. Um, and it's important to recognize that, because if you're kind of absolutist and you think you have all the answers and um, the world is a black and white place, etc., that makes you quite vulnerable to manipulation if you need easy, certain answers. And interestingly, there's some evidence that smart people are more likely to be influenced and manipulated, partly because they're lacking that intellectual humility, and they think that because they're smart, they know all the answers and they're right about everything. They're also very good at kind of justifying why they think what they think. It's called motivated reasoning. They're good at coming up with explanations for their beliefs, even though the real reason is probably usually quite emotional. Um, and Carl Jung said the only thing that protects you from being brainwashed by a mass movement is being aware that you could be brainwashed by a mass movement. So, from that sense, self-awareness is very important. And then from the other sense, there's the kind of meditative aspect. So the more you meditate, according to some research, the less likely you are to be manipulated, because it puts you in touch with your emotions, really, your feelings, your senses, and your emotions. So you can become more aware of when those emotions are high or when they maybe have been inflamed or stoked. And so you can become more aware of when you might be being manipulated or when you go into a vulnerable state where you could be manipulated.
Talk to me about how concerned we should be about the amount of data that is for all of us out there these days. So there was actually I heard you talking about a study where analysts could tell so much about an individual's personality without requiring much information. It was just a picture of their bedroom alone. So with this in mind, it doesn't actually take that much data to figure out people. How concerned should we actually be about the amount of data that is out there for all of us in the modern world? And especially when you combine this with artificial intelligence and machine learning, the advancements in those two areas, how concerned should we be?
I would say quite concerned. So it depends really how it's used. And I think the potential for abuse is quite high. So first of all, probably most people don't realize the amount and extent of data points that we're giving off every time we use the internet and so forth, and how predictive models can use that to predict things about you that you really might find quite surprising or counterintuitive. So I'll give you an example. I worked for a company that has an SDK that that companies can put into their app, and this will scrape data from your phone. I mean, you have to give it permission, but it will take all sorts of metadata. Like, for example, what time of day you tend to take photographs, and how many other countries you've been to, how many contacts you have in your phone, how many of different kind of apps you have in your phone. And from these, you can build models to predict things about people. So they, for example, built a model to predict whether people would be a good loan applicant or not. If they didn't have any health and fitness apps on their phone, they were less likely to be a good applicant, presumably because people who are not at all into health and fitness are less kind of organized and more impulsive. So the model, it wasn't just based on that one thing, but all of these data points together to predict certain things about people. There was the retailer Target in the US could predict that a teen girl was pregnant before she'd even told her dad. And they did that through her loyalty card. They could see what she'd been buying. Certain vitamins and supplements and so on could predict that she was pregnant. And that was like 10 years ago, that one. Research with Facebook likes has been able to predict mental health, drug use, and sexuality. Another study by, I think, the same researchers predicted sexuality from a profile photo. And there's also a case in the US of a priest who was a very vocal critic of Biden, a Catholic priest. Some blog, apparently, is probably intelligence services, to be honest, but some blog bought all this commercially available data, and they de-anonymized it, basically. So they knew where the priest lived and where he worked, and they could find the row in the data file that was in that location for working hours and sleeping hours, and they figured out that was him. And they could see that he, this Catholic priest, had been using Grindr, and they kind of outed him and obviously ruined his career and everything. But the point being that all sorts of things, even very personal things, can be predicted from your data footprints. It's not necessarily a bad thing or a terrible thing, using it for targeted adverts. Is it that bad? Probably not. In fact, the more targeted an advert, the better, really, because it's just giving you information that is actually useful for you and that you want. But is it used for, I don't want to get too political, but, freezing protesters' bank accounts, that kind of thing? I think that starts to get into quite risky, very risky territory. And then we haven't even talked about biometrics and Neuralink, things that can actually read your mind from the source and change it as well. There's a study that found that applying magnets to certain parts of the outside of the skull could change people's political attitudes by disabling temporarily certain parts of the brain. So, it's quite a scary world that we're moving into. I think, on the flip side, there's a lot of optimism and potential and whatnot, but usually when there's an industrial revolution, it's kind of used for bad stuff first. So I think we might have a tricky few years to get through, but after that there'll be loads of innovation and growth and development. I think it'll be a real golden age, hopefully.
So you touched on Neuralink there. What are your thoughts on that? Because I think that's something we're all going to face in the future. It's becoming more and more reality. When I was younger, this was like science fiction. You saw films about it and thought, nah, probably not in my lifetime. But now it doesn't feel like it's that far away. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, the same with AI as well. I mean, I know we don't technically have AI. We have large language models, but predictive algorithms, but it's pretty good. It's pretty close. It's probably not that far until we have real AI. My thoughts are that I don't think I will ever use Neuralink or even like an Apple Vision Pro headset because I look at the effect that technology, especially screen-based technology, has on people, including myself. I don't think it's good, really. I mean, there's great stuff. We can have this conversation. I can be very productive with work. I can learn things I never knew before, but that's a very productive, functional use of it. I don't think it's really used for that. I think it's used much more for emotional uses, which are probably not great. And so the more people use social media and the internet, generally speaking, I think the worse their lives and their mental health. And so going into this world of Vision Pro and everything, I think there's a big risk. It's just really not going to be good for people.
Yeah, I think when you say you don't want to personally use it, I feel the same way, but I also have this concern that it could be such a competitive advantage for those that do use it, that kind of like that film Gattaca, where they're editing genes, and if you don't have your genes edited, ultimately everyone can just outcompete you. How, it's just terrifying when you think of the future like that. Do you think it's realistic to never use Neuralink if other people are using it?
Well, I think the Amish are pretty happy and healthy. They're doing just fine. So I think there'll be some kind of community like that moving forward. Um, and I think you can still use this technology mindfully. So again, it's that incrementalism thing. I am being a bit extreme by saying I'll never use it. I'm sure, to be honest, I will use it eventually, but it's using it purposefully and mindfully. There's this great technology that we have that really improves our lives, but we just need to make sure that the technology is the tool we're using rather than we're being used by the technology. And I know what you're saying. I see this a lot on LinkedIn, and I think it's what people like the World Economic Forum are saying, that there's kind of this evolutionary split coming where the people who use AI and robotics and the metaverse and everything will be this new species who will be more advanced, and the old species who don't use this technology will have a disadvantage and die out. But like I said, if you look at the data, and even anecdotally, the more people use this kind of technology, they're not really doing well. I mean, their mental health is not great. But more importantly than that, the more people use this technology, like the internet, there was a study showing, the less likely they are to have kids. And obviously, there's nothing wrong with not having kids. People have all sorts of reasons to not have kids, but it's not like a winning evolutionary strategy, to be honest. So my view personally, and obviously I'm biased, and I want the best for myself. But I'm thinking and hoping that actually it's people who don't get completely swept up and taken away, who use this technology mindfully and purposefully and to a limited extent. I think they are actually the ones who have the upper hand, rather than the people who completely go fully into it.
You also touched on the Apple's new headset coming out. What are your thoughts on this?
In what way? Sorry.
I guess when you talk about how bad screen time is, and it's only going to exacerbate the issue. How afraid should we actually be about technologies like this?
Well, I'm trying to think whether to give my diplomatic professional answer or my real answer. I'll start with the diplomatic one. Well, I think my personal feeling is that in the future, or even now, increasingly, the political divide is not going to be like left right. It's going to be fantasy reality. And the people who are wearing these headsets all the time, they're just so much more vulnerable to manipulation because they're living in this screen-based world. And there are I don't know what you think about this, but these news reports recently about how UFOs are real and aliens are real, UAPs, I think they call them now. I don't know if it makes me a conspiracy theorist to not believe in aliens. This is the crazy upside down world we're living in. But I think the people who are wearing the headsets are much more liable to be made to believe in aliens, even though they may not exist. If you see what I'm saying. I mean, if somebody I don't want to get too conspiratorial, but if they were to say aliens do exist and here's some footage and so on, then the people who are really wearing the headsets and everything all the time, they're much more likely to get kind of swept up in that. That maybe that's a bad example, but you see what I mean. If you're living in a screen-based world, you're more likely to go along with that and be less connected to reality and the truth. My even weirder answer. There's a really interesting article. I can't remember the chap's name, but he basically thinks. I'm not saying agree with this necessarily, but he basically thinks that technology is a vehicle for demons from another dimension. But I think that, I know that sounds crazy, but I do think there is like a rational psychological way of interpreting and explaining that, in that it kind of enables patterns of behavior that are kind of dark and not productive. And it kind of inflames people's emotions. Like I said earlier, if you use apps, it's basically like wrath, envy, lust, sloth, etc. These are things that are not good for you as an individual and not good for you for society as a whole. But I think this technology kind of inflames them and exploits them and amplifies them. Um, so yeah, I don't necessarily think it's a good thing, and I can't really see the functional benefit of these headsets. I already have a laptop. It's great. I don't need it attached to my face 24 hours a day, but I could be missing something.
Yeah, I kind of feel the same way. I've
Yeah.
seen examples where you can turn your laptop screen into three giant screens in front of you, which looks kind of cool. But then I'm also just like, I have a laptop screen and I can see it perfectly clearly. Why would I want
Yeah.
something attached to my head? Especially is it's so massive and cumbersome. Like I'm sure in the future it will be a very sleek device, but right now it's gigantic just to add a little bit of augmented reality.
Yeah. And I think that's an interesting phrase as well, because there's a philosophical point. I don't think you can augment reality. I think reality is like as best as it can get. And so this thing it's not reality. If it's not reality, it's probably something worse, especially because it's made by people. And all people, as I said, are biased and imperfect and flawed. Um, and so this is just going to be this new plane of existence, this new dimension that's flawed and imperfect.
Now, going back to something we were talking about earlier, priming and your environment. There was a study where participants were put through a cognitively difficult task. It was involving reading out the colors of changing words. And it was fascinating because some participants were given a lab coat before the experiment, and they found that actually increased their performance during the experiment. However, if they were given the exact same lab coat, but told it was a painter's coat instead of a lab coat, it made no difference whatsoever. So this is fascinating. I mean, just putting on a coat essentially made these people better at a certain task. Can you talk about how our environment and priming can impact our performance in tasks and how we can use that to improve our own performance in our lives?
Yeah, so that was a really interesting study on a principle called enclosed cognition. This idea that what you wear impacts your behavior. So, like you said, wearing a lab coat can make you smarter, according to that study. Another study found that if people wear nurses' scrubs, they score higher on agreeableness, so it makes them kinder, more caring. And another study found that if you wear counterfeit brand luxury sunglasses, you're more likely to cheat in a test. So, yeah, very interesting. And it speaks more broadly to this principle called priming, where what you see in your environment influences you. So, if somebody brings you a hamburger on a plate, you're going to start feeling hungry, because it starts to activate these thoughts and emotions to do with food and hunger. And so that's really what priming is. And so, whatever is in your environment will have some kind of effect on what you're thinking, and therefore what you're doing. Now, that effect can be quite small, and priming effects are notoriously hard to replicate, but it is basically this idea that I said earlier, that symbols manipulate what you're thinking and therefore what you do, which is obviously true. You know, if I wanted a biscuit, I could shout out to my wife, bring me a biscuit, and she would bring me a biscuit. I've influenced her behavior with my words. So that's basically what priming is. And as you said, you can use this to influence your own behavior. Famous example is maybe the power pose, where people stand in a certain position, change their body language deliberately to bring about a certain feeling of confidence before a meeting, for example.
So let's say an example where someone wanted to learn for a test. What what should they do? Like, I mean, the idea of putting on a lab coat um, kind of seems quite on the nose. Is there like specific things that person can do to increase their performance as they study so that they're better on the test?
I don't know if I would assume the lab coat may work. Hasn't been tested. I do know there are other things, principles, psychological principles to help people with tests. If you can, and this is a priming thing as well, if you can revise in the same location that your exam will be, you're going to be surrounded by the same triggers and cues, and that's going to make it easier for you to recall the information when you're doing the exam or the test. But the most important thing is probably what's called the generation effect, where if you create something in your own mind, it's stickier. It kind of sticks to all of these nodes in your memory better than if you were just kind of superficially told it. So if I wanted you later to remember the number 4, it would be more effective for me to ask you what is 2 plus 2 than it would for me just to tell you the number 4. Because when I ask the question, you create it yourself, and that makes it sticky. McDonald's use this quite nicely. They have their jingle. Whenever you hear the jingle now, you automatically think, I'm loving it. So by this kind of Pavlovian conditioning, they get you to think that you love McDonald's every time you hear the jingle, but you're creating the message in your head, which makes it even more effective. So when it comes to studying, the real key is to basically write the information out in your own words. So don't just read it. Don't just copy it word for word. You have to actually write it in your own words, because that means that you're kind of digesting it and it will stick more.
Does that kind of link in with the idea of when you teach someone else, you also tend to teach yourself? It's like one of the best ways to learn is to try and educate someone else on a topic, and you end up learning it yourself that way.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, talk to me. This is really interesting. You talked in your research about short names and nicknames. So instead of Thomas, it would be Tom or Tommy. How did how does this influence likability and popularity according to the research?
There've been a couple of studies, I think, on this, but they found that people who use a shorter name or a nickname are seen as more likable. So I think more cheerful and more popular, whereas people who use a longer name are seen as more moral and authoritative. Other researchers found that if you have a middle initial in your name, like Patrick P. Fagan, that also makes you be seen as more authoritative. Um, and yeah, this is another, I think, priming effect where we associate nicknames with, I guess, friendlier, more approachable people.
That is so interesting. Just making your name shorter or saying the full name changes how people perceive you. Is there so I mean I think people, I guess, I wouldn't say you should change your name based on this, but it's interesting to know that you are changing someone else's psychology of you just by using a nickname, short name, long name.
And there's something called or it's called implicit egoism, where or the was it the first name initial effect or something like that, where we are attracted to people who have similar names to us. And my wife's name is Jasmine, and I'm Patrick, and actually they're both 2-syllable names with an A and an I as the vowels in the first and second syllables. But the name letter effect, or the implicit egoism effect, has found, for example, if your name is Lewis, you're more likely to live in St. Louis. If your name is Dennis, you're more likely to be a dentist. People are more likely to marry someone with the first initial that they share, something like that. I know it sounds crazy, it sounds very far-fetched, but there's many, many, many studies on this effect.
Where does this come from? Because it just sounds so arbitrary. And I've heard something similar before. I've heard that people on dating apps like Tinder are more likely to match with other people if they have the same initials, which just seems
Mm.
so yeah, so arbitrary. Like, where does this come from in the human brain?
We basically like what's familiar to us. So there's a principle, for example, called the mere exposure effect, where in the original experiments they showed Western participants letters from the Chinese alphabet, which to these Westerners were completely meaningless. And then later they were quizzed on Chinese letters, some of them old, some of them new, and just were asked, how much do you like them and do you recognize them? And they didn't recognize them, obviously, because they were meaningless to them, but they did show a higher preference for the ones they'd already seen before. So we just like what's familiar, really, because it's safe. And so there's nothing more familiar than your own name. But there's an interesting thing my wife loves to show me, I think on Instagram or something, called Siblings or Dating, where there's a couple and you have to guess if they're siblings or a couple. And it's just a funny illustration of the point that we tend to be attracted to what's similar to us. It's called homophily. So that could be a demographic thing. You like people from your own city or same age group or whatever, but also clothing, attitudes, all of these things make us like someone more.
The dating or sibling is really interesting. I've seen some pages where you see pictures and you are like, I don't know, these people look so similar. Then it just turns out they're dating. They're not siblings. I've
Yeah,
heard a couple of theories of
yeah,
where that comes from. Some people say it's our egos are so big that we think we're great, so we look for people who look similar to us. Another theory is that we bond with the people when we're a baby that are closest to us, which is our family. So we've learned to associate trust with faces which by definition are going to have similar features to us. So we end up trusting
yeah,
people who have similar features more. Which way
yeah.
around do you reckon it is?
To one of the points I made earlier, I tried to avoid kind of like binary answers. It is probably a combination of both. They both sound right to me. And also maybe there's a genetic thing as well. I know there's studies showing that people can find a mate based on smell alone. I don't know if you've seen that study where they have people wear T-shirts and then other participants smell the T-shirts and rate them on attractiveness. Then they meet the people and rate them on attractiveness, and there's a correlation. So you're attracted to people based on just on smell sometimes. So maybe you're attracted to people who are similar, obviously not too similar, who are kind of similar for like evolutionary reasons, maybe. My wife looks nothing like me then.
Yeah. Okay. I guess because you're maybe conscious of it as well. It allows
Maybe,
you to
yeah.
not be so influenced by things. Like going through a dating app, I imagine you wouldn't be as affected by something having the same initials because you'd be like, well, I know this is stupid. I should look out for characteristics that actually matter. So talk to me about the Ash experiment. I think this is really interesting because it was an experiment where a number of people were brought in and shown pictures of lines. The task was to match the two lines of the same length, and all of the answers were actually really obvious. It was very straightforward. You look at it and you could tell the answer in 2 seconds. However, what one participant didn't know is that the other participants in the study were paid actors and they were intentionally giving the wrong answer. So even though it's really obvious what the right answer is, they were saying the wrong one. And after a while, they found that the real participant began to match their answers, even though he could clearly see what the actual correct answer was. So I feel like this is fascinating because it goes to show how powerful the pressure to comply to societal norms really is for all of us. Can you talk about this and how we can all try to see things as they actually are in not just how society tells us to think?
Um, yeah, well, you summed up the experiment perfectly there, and it's been replicated many times in the decades since, and even online recently, it's been replicated. So it's quite a robust finding. And essentially, people don't like to speak up against the crowd and to not go along with the crowd. Um, Now, there's an evolutionary value to that. If nobody is eating berries from a particular bush, you should probably avoid those berries as well. Um, that's social proof. But obviously, also, it can lead into groupthink and, I don't know, the Enron scandal and totalitarianism, and at its extreme. Um, so, and also interestingly as well, the social pressure gets you to say something that you might not think is true, but then when you say it, then you'll start to rationalize it, and you'll probably start to believe it. So we tend to think that our behaviors are driven by attitudes, but often actually is the other way around as well, where our attitudes are driven by our behaviors. So one study had people hold a pen in their mouth like this, and they rated cartoons as funnier because the pen was forcing their mouth into kind of a smile. So that was their attitude being influenced by their behavior. So if you are forced one way or another to say something, then you'll probably start to adopt it and believe it. Maybe not in the Ash experiment because it's very obvious what the right answer is, but in life things aren't so clear cut. And so then if there's a little bit of doubt, then you will start to believe something just because you've been pressured into saying it. And so the way to overcome that is to, first of all, have the courage to speak up against something that is not true. Also I think humor is good. It is good to use humor to kind of puncture the veil of non-truthfulness. So there are stories and fairy tales which kind of have these lessons, like the Emperor's New Clothes is this young boy who speaks up and says something, and that's kind of a comical image really of this naked emperor being suddenly found out. Or the man behind the curtain in The Wizard of Oz, it seems like a big scary wizard, but actually it's just a tiny man behind a curtain. So it's all about kind of revealing and even ridiculing these things. And what you can also do is make your decisions in private, because if we have a tendency to conform to the group, then just if it's an important decision or something, get away from the group, and people are less likely to be biased in private.
Oh, touching on one of your points there, I think is so interesting. The idea that it's not just thoughts that change actions, it's also actions that change thoughts. And that kind of made me think of something people talk about, which is if you want to feel happier, you should smile more, because that begins to release, I think, various hormones in your brain, which actually makes you feel happier. Have you looked into this research? How accurate is all of this?
Well, yeah, I know there's some research that you can kind of fake it till you make it to an extent. So if there's a certain way you want to be, then embody those behaviors and you will become that way. The laughter one is interesting. I haven't heard of that, but I do remember maybe a year or so ago, I had a quite stressful couple of years, as most of the world did. And I just one day realized I don't laugh anymore. So I listened to a comedy show, Norm Macdonald, and made me laugh a lot. And I suddenly felt a lot better and actually had these kind of even physical symptoms. I was not feeling well for a long time. And then when I laughed, it just kind of made me feel better. I could let go of all the stress and even these negative physical symptoms. It was quite transformative, actually.
I kind of found the same thing. I found myself often going down so many rabbit holes of learning about things, but I wasn't taking the time just to enjoy the moment. I ended up following different people on something like Instagram, where I just follow pages where something funny happens and you end up laughing out loud.
Yeah.
And it does seem to have a it affects you not just when you're watching it, it seems to improve your entire life.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Okay, so you have a book coming out shortly.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about it? What's it about and who would benefit from reading it? There it is.
There it is.
Free Your Mind.
So it's called Free Your Mind, The New World of Manipulation and How to Resist It. And you can pre-order it on Amazon, or actually, I think you can buy it on Amazon when this podcast comes out. And it is about, as we were talking about earlier, there's all of these attempts to manipulate us and persuade us constantly every day. And there's no way to get away from that. But it has kind of got worse and seems to be getting worse over time with technology, social media, headsets, big data, AI, all of that. And so this book arms you with the tools and the armor to not be influenced, or at least manage the influence. So there are certain tips in there about, like I said, meditation, how to cut down your phone usage, how to deal with people in negotiations, all of these kind of things. And we did a lot of research to find these tips. So my co-author and I, my co-author is Laura Dodsworth, a journalist, a very talented one. And we, for example, joined cults. I went to this retreat in the woods for the weekend where I had all my stuff taken away from me. My name was taken away from me. Had to wake up at 6 a.m. to go and shower outside in November. We did a sweat lodge, all this kind of stuff. I also joined Scientology for the day. It's not in the book because they would have sued us, but the tips and things I learned in the book are in the book. Obviously I'm biased, but I think it's like an entertaining way to find out just the extent of all of this information, but more importantly, how it works and how you can resist it.
Oh, well, I really appreciate you giving up your time today to have this conversation.
Thank you.
If people want to follow your work, so obviously they can go and buy the book. There'll be a link in the description. But if they just want to follow your work more generally, where's the best place for someone to go?
Either LinkedIn or Twitter, and I'm pfagan87 on both. But yeah, please do buy the book.